We will continue our study of the first chapter of Judges. In our last lesson, we found that the early verses indicated the Judites and their allies, the Simeonites and Kenites, had some success in defeating a number of cities in their allotted territory. However, in chapter 1, verse 19, we found the word but, after which the Bible states that they were unable to defeat the Canaanites who lived on the Mediterranean coastal plain because they had iron chariots. I will discuss the iron chariot issue later in our study of Judges when we address the judge Deborah. However, the failure on the part of the Judites was not one of power but of faith. This lack of faith apparently paralyzed them with fear. Later in chapter 2, verse 2, God would call this disobedience. It is interesting that King David, a man after God's own heart, would write in Psalms 20, verse 7, "Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God." Returning to chapter 1 of Judges, verse 21, we find another but, and it reports that the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. Now this refers back to our last lesson, where I discussed the fact that the Judites had conquered Jerusalem but failed to control it, even though it was in Benjamin's territory. Verses 22 through 26 are curious. The Bible states the tribe of Joseph, obviously referring to Ephraim and Manasseh, since they were immediately north of Benjamin, fought against Bethel, a town in Benjamin's territory, and the Lord was with them. In describing how the city was taken, the Joseph tribes sent spies to the city. They saw a man coming out of the city and asked him to show them the way into the city. Now, the English wording here is awkward and doesn't seem to make much sense. However, the Hebrew refers to the exit used by the man as a concealed one, not the main gate that would have been obvious. It was customary for cities with large walls to close the main gates at dusk. However, there were small, concealed entrances through which only one person at a time could enter a city, called postern gates, or in Hebrew, mabo. These small openings provide access to the city for its citizens after the main gates were closed. If you open the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this lesson to the first slide after the introductory one, that would be slide number 2, you will see a picture of such an entrance preserved in an ancient city wall that has been archaeologically excavated in modern Turkey. Although 2 of the tribes had success, at least initially, we read beginning in verse 27 to the end of the chapter a long depressing list of how other tribes did not drive out the Canaanites, and in many cases the tribes put the Canaanites to forced labor rather than expel them from the land. Chapter 2 opens with verses 1 through 5 in which the angel of the Lord spoke to the people and reminded them that the Lord had redeemed them out of Egypt and established a covenant with them that required they make no treaties with the Canaanites and avoid idolatry. But the Israelites had already failed on both accounts. However, the angel affirmed 2 things. First, God would never break his covenant with them, and God would not drive out the inhabitants of the land before them. Instead, the Israelites would have to do that work, and it was clear they were failing. Hearing the words, the Israelites wept and offered sacrifices. But considering what happens next, those tears were not of true remorse, but probably tears for the penalty that was going to happen as a result of their disobedience. As one author has written, true repentance must go beyond tears of sorrow and achieve a right-about face, a turning of one's entire life from sin to a walk that pleases God. The author of Judges then renewed the history of Joshua's death at 110 years of age, and also his place of burial, all of which was also recorded in the closing verses of the book of Joshua. The most striking part of these verses is verse 10 that concludes with the startling statement that the next generation, quote, did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Isn't that sad? The chapter continues to describe the Israelites' condition of spiritual indifference in verses 11 through 15. The verses describe how in the days of Joshua the people worshiped the Lord, but this very next generation, the one that was introduced in verse 10, did not acknowledge the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. It is amazing that the Israelites so quickly resorted to worshiping idols and followed other gods. The result was that the Lord's anger was raised, and even when the Israelites did take to the field to fight or expel the Canaanites, God was no longer with them on the field. In most cases, the enemy prevailed. What a terrible predicament the Israelites found themselves. But God, in his infinite mercy, showed compassion on them, and in verses 16 through 19, God provided for judges after whom this book is named. God designated these unusual and, I believe, godly persons for one particular mission: to provide temporary power to the Israelites to help them gain freedom from those who burdened them. Yet, despite this wonderful gift from a forgiving God, the author tells us that after being saved, the people would again return to their sinning ways. At the end of chapter 2, the author also wrote why this situation existed. God had tested the people by leaving some of the Canaanites in the land to see whether or not the Israelites would continue to walk in the way of the Lord, as had Joshua's generation. Unfortunately, the people failed the test badly. And, sadly, God said he would no longer drive out any of the nations that remained in the land because the people had not obeyed him. These verses also establish a 5-phase pattern we will see throughout the remainder of the book, and is the history of the Israelites for the next 3 centuries. This pattern is first rebellion, second judgment and punishment, 3 repentance, 4th deliverance, and 5 rest or a period of peace. Although the steps are not present in the discussion of some of the minor judges, the pattern is seen in the major judges. The rebellion is, of course, how the Israelites shamelessly abandoned God and bowed down to the idols of filth and uncleanness. You see, they worshipped and served Baal and Ashtoreth, the false deities of the Canaanites. You may remember in the previous lesson that I pointed out these phases are cyclical. However, as you read, you will learn they become increasingly more awful in their degree, spiraling downward until culminating in the horrible stories in the last 5 chapters of the book. Although we may find the stories of the judges distasteful, they should also show us the character of God. God is involved in the world and delivers sinful but repentant people. The judges of the Old Testament were men and one woman who could plan military operations and raise and lead an army. They were individuals who were selected by God for a specific service. They had good judgment, gave wise counsel, and protected the legal and political rights of the people. So in summary, we should remember that as Judges 2:18 informs us, 1. Judges were raised by God, 2. The Lord was with them, and 3. The Lord used them to deliver Israel. I wonder sometimes at how many times God has used trials, tribulations, and suffering to get me to pay more attention to him. As God placed the Israelites in situations that only he could rescue them from, God also is known to put us in circumstances where only he can rescue us. I am always amazed at how personal and concerned our God is to each and every one of us. Chapter 3 opens with the continuation of the sins of the Israelites and how they cooperated and intermarried with the Canaanites and also worshiped their idols until, in verse 9, we learn that the Lord allowed a king from Mesopotamia, Cushan-Rishathaim, to come into the land and oppress the people for 8 years. When this occurred, God anointed Othniel, the great fighter and Caleb's younger brother we have read about before, to deliver Israel. The means by which Othniel used to defeat Cushan-Rishathaim are not given in the brief account. However, we can learn some things from this verse. First, Cushan came from a long way away. Please refer to the PowerPoint for this lesson and turn to the next slide, number 3. Some English Bibles translate the place from where the king came as Mesopotamia. Others call it Aram Naharaim. On the map in the PowerPoint, it shows that both Mesopotamia and Aram Naharaim mean the land between the rivers. The rivers are, of course, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the land is in the northern part of what today is known as Iraq. In history books, Aram Naharaim is also known as Mitanni, a nation that was defeated by the Hittites about 1344 BC, never to revive again. Thus this places the invasion by Cushan into Canaan in the years at the beginning of the 1300s, and this date fits very well with the early conquest theory and the conquest began in 1406 BC and ended 5 years later. Also, it is assumed by many Bible scholars that Joshua died around 1390 BC. Therefore, the Israelite evil activities described in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 3 must have occurred sometime between 1390 and 1344 BC before Mitanni fell to the Hittites. One of the issues I believe we should try to do is to identify the characteristics of the men and one woman that God selected as judges. Although Othniel is considered a minor judge, we know something about him from both the books of Joshua and Judges. It is interesting that I can find no negative comments in the Bible about Othniel, and therefore I believe he demonstrated the following qualities: courage, capability, humility, and a demonstration that he was a man of God. You may think of more, but I think that with those qualities God chose Othniel to confront and defeat the foreign invader. It is also important to note that the Bible says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, as will happen to 3 more judges. The Spirit enabled Othniel to accomplish what he couldn't do unaided. After Othniel's success, there followed 40 years of peace, so the cycle was completed. Although only 3 verses in Judges discusses Othniel's judgeship, other verses in the Bible present Othniel to us as a model of the type of man God uses and will use: courageous and willing to undertake hard assignments. Remember, he fought giants at Debir and moved against the foreign invader from Mesopotamia. In verse 10, the author of Judges starts to bring us back to reality, and reports that the Israelites again did wrong in the sight of the Lord. In this case, it was a king named Eglon from Moab, a land to the east of the Jordan River. Eglon invaded and occupied Jericho, here called the City of Palms. You should remember that Jericho had been defeated and destroyed by Joshua, but apparently had not been rebuilt because of Joshua's curse. See Joshua 6:26. However, the curse did not pertain to a foreign, non-Israelite king like Eglon. Eglon undoubtedly saw the strategic importance of Jericho to control trade, and he used the ruins of Jericho and constructed himself a palace. Archaeologist John Garstang excavated a building on the ruins of Jericho that he dated to the time of Eglon. Garstang strongly suggested that it was the palace of Eglon. On the left side of the next PowerPoint slide, that's number 4, is an aerial photograph of the tell at Jericho. On the right is a schematic showing the primary excavations areas. Area A is the general location where Garstang located the building he dated to the time of Eglon. The next slide, number 5, is a photograph of Garstang and also the areas it looked at the time of the excavations in the late 1930s. Since Jericho is in the tribal allocation of Benjamin, the occupation of Jericho probably most affected the Benjaminites. Thus we find the next judge, Ehud, is indeed a Benjaminite. The Bible provides a detail in verse 15 to which we should pay attention. It states that Ehud was left-handed. Later in Judges 20:16, we will again find that many of the Benjaminites were left-handed. Knowing this piece of information will help us understand the events that follow. The story continued, and we learn that Eglon oppressed the Israelites for 18 years, and as a consequence, the Israelites paid tribute or a tax to Eglon. On this particular occasion, Ehud was selected to deliver the money. But he prepared for the encounter by making a double-edged sword about 18 inches or 46 centimeters in length, and he concealed it on his right thigh under his clothes. The details are significant since at this time swords carried by soldiers were necessarily sickle-shaped, since they were made from bronze metal that normally would not withstand a frontal thrust. Therefore, the sickle-shaped swords were used as chopping-type weapons. However, even if Ehud was suspected of carrying a shorter knife, the enemy would have thought of it being carried on his left side, the side most easily accessible to a right-handed person. But Ehud was left-handed, and he carried a long straight sword on his right thigh, two actions that would help prevent detection. Ehud persuaded Eglon to give him a private audience, and when alone, Ehud drew the sword and thrust it into the belly of the very fat Eglon. Here again it is useful to understand the meaning of the terms used in this story. The Bible states that Eglon met the king in his cool roof chamber. That's chapter 3, verse 20. Most archaeologists believe that this cool roof chamber was in fact a bathroom on the second floor of the building. Now go to the next slide of the PowerPoint presentation, number 6. It is a schematic of the floor plan of the building that Garstang excavated. There was a stairway that led to an upper chamber, probably a bathroom. On the right side, I have added a photograph of a stone toilet seat found in an excavation in Jerusalem. It can be assumed that Eglon's room had a seat similar to this one. Next, note the door that separated the bathroom from the vestibule or outer room. It is assumed that Ehud closed this door and locked himself inside and then stabbed Eglon in the bathroom. Since Ehud could not return out the same way he came in, Ehud undoubtedly made his escape through the hole in the floor where the toilet refuse would normally go. After making his escape, Ehud returned to the hill country, where he sounded a trumpet and raised an army. The army then blocked the crossings over the Jordan River the Moabites might have used to return to their country, and slaughtered many Moabites. Following Ehud's success, the land again rested for 80 years. In reviewing Ehud's judgeship, I find him to be bold, daring, efficient, and fully committed to carrying out the mission to which God had called him, that was to deliver the Israelites from the Moabites. Remember, he was not a spiritual leader, as was Othniel, and it is not recorded that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. But Ehud was fully aware that it was not his cleverness or his power that gave the victory, but rather it was the power of God. His battle cry, as given in Judges 3:28, was, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies into your hand." The next judge, the third, is Shamgar, and he is discussed in only one short verse, Judges 3:31. Quite obviously, Shamgar is considered to be a minor judge, but he was still important enough to warrant mention. He killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. We do not know if those killed were all at one time, or that was a total he slew over a period of time. Shamgar, however, presents a perplexing problem. His name indicates he was a foreigner, and he may have come from Beth Anath that we read about in chapter 1, verse 33. Beth in Hebrew means house, and Anath was a goddess whom Canaanites believed fought for Baal. Shamgar, therefore, may have been a convert from paganism to the belief in the one true God. However, there is no question as to his weapon. It was an ox goad, or a long wooden spear-like instrument with a point on one end used to prod draft animals and a blade for scraping the hoofs of the animals on the other end. This simple instrument also indicated that Shamgar was probably of humble origins, perhaps a peasant farmer. The discussion of Shamgar's judgeship in chapter 3, verse 31, before the biblical author reports the death of Ehud in chapter 4, verse 1, could mean that Shamgar judged during the 80 years following Ehud. Also, Deborah, the next judge, mentions Shamgar in Judges 5, verse 6. This could mean that he was a contemporary of hers, too. On the next PowerPoint slide, number 7, I have summarized some thoughts about Shamgar for you to consider. As we finish chapter 3, we should look back at the different backgrounds of the three judges in this chapter. The first, Othniel, was of outstanding ability and spirituality. Ehud had limitations, and Shamgar was of very humble origins. The diversity of these three men show that God can use all of us for His ministry, regardless of our background or what we perceive to be our limitations. God will use us as we are for His glory. With that comment, I will conclude this lesson, and in our next lesson, we will look in depth at Deborah's judgeship.